Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to If Data Could Talk. I'm your host, Andy Cockgreave. It's great to see you all. Today, I'm joined by our guest, Clayton Aldern, who is Senior Data Reporter at Grist. Grist. Clayton, welcome to the show. Tell us something about Grist and the goals of the organization.
Yeah, gladly. They've changed a lot over the years. So it's a good question. Grist was founded 20 odd years ago, I think 1999, as an environmental newsletter, right? So we sought to, and we're talking 1.5 full-time employees then. And the goal was to, raise the alarm of climate change. We knew it was happening then, but we're based in the United States, and there was a little bit of an information gap. And the goal of this newsletter was to fill that gap and, do a little doom and gloom here and there, but try to keep it light. It was a bit of a humor magazine in that sense. And then, flash forward 15, 20 years, that information gap is gone. And we wouldn't necessarily take credit for all of that, but we like to imagine we had something to do with it. The new gap is this notion that climate change is solvable, right? The fact that people believe that it's happening, but they don't believe they can do anything about it. And so Grist is a magazine headquartered in Seattle, but now we've got 50, 60 folks spread across the country. We've got an office in New York, and our tagline is Climate Justice Solutions. We write about the world of the possible, and we think about how climate change is an issue that affects people today.
Yeah, that's right. Was it a print publication in the 20 years ago, or
never? We've always been online.
Right. Okay. Great. And how about you? What does a senior data reporter do, and how did you get to Grist?
Yeah, a question I'm asking myself every day. So this is my second tour of duty at Grist. I first came to the organization in 2015. We operate a fellowship for young, early career journalists. So as a fellow reporting on climate and energy policy, I got to go to COP21, the Paris climate talks, pretend I was a real reporter. It was great. But this was my first foray into journalism. Before that, I'd been in computational neuroscience. I did a master's in public policy. I wasn't sure where I was going to end up. And Grist was great, but I did this year-long fellowship and then went into the public sector for a while. I was in homelessness and housing policy. I was doing some freelancing, doing some consulting, and then about a year and a half, 2 years ago, came back to Grist. In part to help build out a data journalism team. And so now I am on that team 2 years later. And, what is it that we do? We seek to make the complexities and intangibilities of data related to climate change, less complex and more tangible. We seek to communicate the stories of environmental justice and climate change using the manifold data sets that are out there in the world.
So it's obviously with COP26 happening in the UK in November, it's obviously hugely important and in front of many people's minds. I think this gap, you're right to identify. It's one I feel the pain of. I sometimes am unsure what to do. I look to leadership of our countries, but it's like I also realize I could start taking action as well. Now, from a data journalism perspective, a lot of our audience are, know about data visualization. And so tell us a little bit about the role, visualizing data or communicating data in your pages can help, people like me and our audience sort of connect the dots and maybe drive to action.
Yeah, gladly. I mean, the thing about climate change is it's just really big. It's quite amorphous and it doesn't respect borders or, these things we call generations, right? It's kind of everywhere all at once. So the challenge with coming to terms with it, and I would argue by extension, acting on it, is the fact that it's just quite slippery. I think data helps give us a foothold, and data visualization in particular is this thing that allows us to kind of pull down these abstractions into the realm of the present and the tangible and the emotionally resonant, right? If you kind of can't wrap your head around something, how are you supposed to act on it in the first place? In practice, what does that mean with respect to spurring action per se? It's a tricky question. I think it's a tricky question that nonprofit journalism, and we are a nonprofit, asks itself all the time. What does it mean to measure impact in journalism? And more specifically, what does it mean to measure impact with respect to data visualization or data reporting in nonprofit journalism? I like to think about it something like this, right? If somebody reads a piece on grist.org and then modifies their behavior in some capacity, we wouldn't argue that there's ever a causal connection there per se, but maybe we're part of the equation. And so one of the things that we do is regularly run these on-site surveys that ask, given what you've read on grist.org, have you modified your behavior in some capacity? And that isn't to suggest that like subbing out, plastic straws for metal straws is going to solve the climate crisis. And indeed, I think that type of individual action probably unfairly pins the onus of change on the individual, but rather we ask questions about, have you attended a protest? Have you written a legislator about your own legislative priorities? And 2/3 of the time, people say yes. I given what I've read on Grist, I've changed my behavior. I've done something like that. So then I get to argue in my comfy little chair, well, maybe I had something to do with that.
That's really interesting. One of the, as I speak to customers of Tableau, all the time, that they have a similar challenge actually to you as a nonprofit. So how do they justify the investment in data visualization and analytics? How do you pin, that dashboard or that chart in that presentation as actually influencing the change? And it's a really amorphous thing to try and identify, because you can't go, oh yeah, that chart made me change. It's part of a whole, isn't it? And it's just part of a big suite of communication options, right? From charts to video to the written word.
Yeah. And that said, sorry for interrupting. There are instances in which we'll hear back from another nonprofit, right? Maybe like an advocacy group or a grassroots community organizing group who said, we really appreciate you covering this issue. It brought this set of questions to the light, where they weren't before. And specifically, the chart that you included in your story, we're able to take that to a public comment period. And like, this is a tangible asset that we can show to a city council member or a county council member and make an argument, maybe more succinctly than we had originally written in our 800-word testimony. So, and we get that kind of feedback all the time, that instead of just appearing on the page, these assets are used for something, right? We've seen Grist charts appear in a Senate floor speech by Senator Whitehouse. So that's the kind of thing where it's like, these assets can have a life off of the page, and that's maybe where we start to move from kind of just tossing stuff into the void to, hey, maybe this is meaning something.
And that is remarkably similar to to things our customers do. It's like that they get that validation when their work is used somewhere else. Now, sometimes it's a dashboard copy and pasted into a PowerPoint presentation. It's like, oh, the dashboard doesn't work in a PowerPoint, but at least when the good design is pasted, it's a really good win. So that's great. Now, another thing I noticed when I read the articles on Grist is, we can look at climate change on the global scale and just get overwhelmed and fearful. But my sense from Grist articles is actually you don't tend to focus on that mega picture. It's always quite local. So Texas oil wells or things like that. Is that a deliberate policy to try and make this enormous body of data and evidence slightly more manageable?
Certainly. I mean, I think in addition to arguing that climate change is a matter of the present, we would say that climate change is something that happens in place, right? You can only tell the story of climate change if you tell it as a local story. And by only tell the story, I mean only tell the story responsibly, right?
Yeah.
Grist doesn't exist to, regurgitate the findings of the IPCC, right? There are institutions out there in the world doing a great job of telling the global story of climate change. But in terms of, and maybe this goes back to your question about driving action, I mean, our theory of change basically says people aren't going to act on climate, people aren't going to feel this thing until they understand or sense or indeed already feel, but have new words to articulate, that thing's relevance, that thing's local context. And so we argue climate change and environmental justice, by definition, is a local issue, something that happens in place. And so we work to partner with a lot of local newsrooms in our reporting. We seek to tell stories that appeal, both to a national audience, but to a community for whom the stories are most relevant. And the flip side of the coin is we get to take stories that local communities have been raising for months and months or years and years, and occasionally bring those stories to a broader audience and say, hey, these folks have been yammering about this for a really long time, and it's about time someone in Washington listened.
Tell me, I want to get in a few minutes. I want to get into sort of maybe the process of data journalism at Grist, but just let's dive into those partnerships a little bit, because you're sort of a news magazine but an environmental organization. Is it how do those partnerships work? And is it like a consultancy in some ways?
Well, it's a good question. So it's important to qualify the fact here that Grist, the media organization, operates a couple different programs, right? So one of the things we do, as you mentioned, is publish a magazine. Another thing we do is operate this solutions lab that we call Fix. So, Fix seeks to convene environmental leaders, right? Folks who are working on scaling climate solutions, and by extension, introduce those people to one another, and then, perhaps offer a platform for op-eds from them, indeed host in-person or virtual gatherings such that they're able to connect with one another in a meaningful manner. Fix just hosted this really wonderful climate fiction contest, which is all about imagining possible futures in 2200. So there's the journalism arm, there's this climate solutions lab, and then we also have a set of programs around talent and representation. And so Grist operates this early career journalism fellowship that I mentioned. We also fiscally sponsor a couple entities that are working on related, kind of media ecosystem work. And so this is all to say, when we use the word partnership, we can use it in a couple different contexts. In the journalism context, what that often means is thinking about co-reporting and co-publishing. You'd mentioned this story about oil wells in Texas and New Mexico. It doesn't make sense for a data reporter like me to just kind of helicopter down into the Permian Basin and pretend I know about the local context there. Instead, it makes an infinite amount more sense to get in touch with a reporter, who lives in rural Texas and works at the Texas Observer, and let someone like him interview the ranchers in question, because he already knows them. So this is the kind of partnership wherein Grist will seek to connect with the local newsroom. The two newsrooms in question may jointly apply for funding. For example, in this case, we sought some support from the Pulitzer Center, who stepped in to pay for some of the reporting costs here. And then these three entities, to the extent that they're connected, work on co-publishing this thing. Chris in Texas reports on the ground. My colleague Navina at Grist works on, the kind of public accountability angle. She's doing a lot of public records requests and archival research. Then I'm kind of just sitting here behind my screen building a statistical model, and then we work on commissioning some drone photography, getting this thing all on the page, and then we can publish a print version in the Text Observer and a digital version on Grist. And then, somebody like the Pulitzer Center can help us get the word out even further.
Yeah, that is fantastic. These answers are great. I mean, because, talking about helicoptering in and being a problem, that's a standard challenge for people watching. That, when you try and create a data culture, but then analyze data on behalf of other people across the organization or customers, and if you're not the person in there who knows the data, we've seen in AI all the sorts of ethical problems of that, but it happens on a smaller scale in businesses. And then I think it's really interesting that you talk about Fix and how that's a community that you're developing as well. It's a big part of our data culture programs is always build a community in your organization, because then the sum becomes so much more than the parts itself. I also love the idea of the fiction competition, because what I see in community projects that our community runs is when you tackle things from completely wacky tangents, and don't be offended, writing fiction is it's a tangent. It's not wacky at all, but it generates different thinking. Is that the kind of thing you've seen, right? It opens new perspectives.
Yes, certainly. I mean, I used the word imaginative earlier, and I think part of the goal there is to just think outside of the realm of what feels currently possible. Yeah, I think the realm of the possible is often this really limiting set of boundaries, and it takes courage and creativity to get outside of it. But once you can, all of a sudden this set of imaginative futures starts to feel a little more within reach. Yeah. And what in practice, what do I mean by any of that? I just think in the case of something like climate fiction, we have so many modes of writing about the future. And one of those modes is the kind of classic doom and gloom climate reporting that has characterized national media for the past 20 years. That's a mode of imagining the future, but it can turn people off after a while. I read doom and gloom climate reporting every day. It's part of my job to just read apocalypse after apocalypse. Yeah. And that can be a little demotivating, right? But there's another, there are many other modes, but one other mode of thinking about the future is, imagining what a climate utopia might look like. What does a radically inclusive, imaginative future mean? And if you can articulate that, or indeed read about it, what might that imply about how you in turn begin to think about the future? Yeah. What might it imply about what you start to desire as opposed to perhaps fear?
Yeah, that's amazing. It also, I guess, the fiction side of things engages people differently, and it might capture other people in a different way. A few years ago, I got in a big row with Stephen Few, who wrote a lot of books about data visualization, certainly the first ones that inspired me to get into this field. And he had a very dogmatic view of data visualization should be pure and crisp and bar charts, right? Nothing else. And, I bought into that for a long time, but then I remember there was an example of a woman called Miriam Quick, who was a sort of data artist in the UK. And she was studying air quality in Sheffield, which is a city in northern England. And they did an exhibition where she made a necklace. The little components of the necklace from left to right represented the air quality in Sheffield over a particular time period. So it was this big, heavy thing, and it had this massive spike here where the air quality had plummeted. And Stephen Few was like, this is a joke. This is not data visualization. And it's like, well, of course it is. And as Miriam pointed out, she's like, yeah, but I can take that to a gallery or to a school or to a community center where nobody in that place cares about charts, but they can physically feel this power. And that was a really big learning point for me, that, your Grist is about climate. I'm generally more about data, and obviously there's a big overlap between the two of us. But it's about thinking, how can you come at things differently to get your own inspiration, but also to meet other people where they are, rather than, in that case, bring them to the boring bar charts.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a question of audience, right? I think boring bar charts serve a purpose.
They do. They do.
And yeah, I mean, sign me up. I think a well-constructed bar chart can get the job done.
Yeah.
And also, there are opportunities to just think a little more rigorously about audience. And so this is another way of saying, I think when folks talk about like getting weird in data visualization, maybe moving in the direction of data art, this conversation is often framed in terms of like, well, what if we did something different? What if we like were more intentional about being creative with our work? And I tend to prefer thinking about it in terms, instead of like diverting oneself from a status quo, I think the frame that resonates for me is one that just says, well, what if you were more rigorous about audience? And if you adopt a frame that isn't about like the medium per se, but instead about the goal of what the medium is supposed to accomplish, I think the creativity shakes down, and so Grist, we're interested in reaching a broad swath of audiences, right? And so by extension, like there are going to be different tools for the job, depending on what segment you're trying to reach or what subpopulation you're trying to have a conversation with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can go back to, there was an episode of If Data Could Talk we did with ProPublica and their COVID tracker, and they had the wacky animated weather vanes, highly inaccurate, but it provided the gist of the COVID trends, and it was super engaging on Twitter, right? So for accurate interpretation of the data, it was hopeless, but that, as they said in the episode, that was literally not the point of it. So they were like, our intent was not for accurate, our intent was to get engagement and then hopefully encourage a bunch of people to click to come and see the detailed.
Right. If their intent was to publish a piece of social science research, right, or of like public health or epidemiology, like they would have done so. Yeah. But the intent was to reach a broader audience, and so by extension, like the tool must look different.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not least because not everybody, has access to academic journals.
No, and
they're often quite expensive.
So, well, they are, right, and it's a real challenge because, again, when you're going to that sort of to the public audience, it's always been a challenge. How do you capture and engage an audience in the few seconds of attention they're going to give you where they consume? So, on social media, so you have to be different enough. Oh, yeah, but it's a very difficult line to tread. I mean, how do you do that at Grist? How do you sort of be brief and engaging to pull people into the deeper article?
No, it's a good question. I mean, I like to give our audience credit. I mean, I think sometimes the timbre of this type of conversation can veer in the direction of, well, we got to like dumb this thing down so like people on the internet engage with it. And I just like, in my experience, maybe people don't want to be bored by what they read or what they see.
I think that's a great way to frame it.
But like, nor do I, nor do people reading academic journals. So as opposed to like dumbing something down, if instead the goal is just to make something engaging or less boring, then if you use that as a North Star, as it were, I think you end up with work that's probably just better by most metrics. What do we do? I think there's a whole team who thinks about this kind of stuff at Grist, right? We have a team of editorial designers. We have folks like me who think about data visualization and data reporting, and then there's a whole swath of folks who think about audience and product and social media. And so, often it means this constellation of folks taking a given story and maybe adapting it for different purposes, right?
Yeah.
There's going to be the full bleed digital version that maybe appeals to someone who isn't bored by 6,000 words and wants that mode of engagement with a story. And then there's going to be the 5-slide Instagram version And then there's maybe going to be the 30-second video short. And, you know, maybe in turn that video short gets re-embedded in another, you know, follow-up article. And if the folks who are reading that article are compelled by that video short, they'll be sent back to the first 6,000 word piece, right? There's kind of a flow here that I think just like trusts people to engage in the manner in which they're most comfortable. And you know, why would you want to do anything else?
Well, it's so true. You know what's interesting. I mean, you know, I'm in marketing in Tableau. That's where I sit, right? And you know, some of those principles are part of marketing. You do multiple versions of what you're doing to attract people through the path that they feel most comfortable at. But as you're saying this, what I realize is I don't actually see many of our customers adopting that as a process for a data culture, and it totally could be, right? It's like you're not just building a dashboard. You know, you're taking the data set instead of that one output, think how does the project you're working on deal with 4 or 5 different outputs to reach people in different modes of consumption? I'm gonna have to think a bit more deeply.
I used to work in, and maybe to a certain extent still kind of do, depending on one's definition, but I used to work in, you know, data culture, as it were, right? When I was in the public sector, I was responsible in my county for, you know, implementing and maintaining a data-driven culture in the county's homelessness programs. You know, what does that mean in practice? Like, as you cited, right? Sometimes it's data communications, right? Sometimes it's dashboarding and ensuring that folks have access to the information that allows them to make decisions. Sometimes it's like writing talking points and like giving folks sound bites that they can use when they're in front of council, for example. Sometimes it is more rigorous research, right? You're conducting a given study and then presenting the results accordingly, you know, given the audience in question. But even in that first case, even in the data communications case, I really do think that there's, you know, and you know, I don't want to be like pandering to the base here, but like Tableau's quite good at this, right? It's pretty easy to like set up different views for different folks. It's like pretty easy to allow a set of permissions on a given dashboard, you know, and a set of views such that you can tailor a given data communication to the audience in question, right? The executive might not need the deep dive, and the analyst might not care about the 10,000 foot view. And I don't know. I think the product is well suited to that. Let me ask you a question. You touched a little bit on the production team, because I think, I think there's probably a really good learning point for people trying to develop their own data analytics teams. You know, you talked about the various different people. What is the sort of production cycle of a data-driven story? Do you start with, you know, do you start with the data? Do you start with the story? How does it follow a path? Great question. And I wish I had a well thought through process.
I'm sure somebody has a PowerPoint slide with a very crisp version of reality, which is
that person is not me. So, but that's not to suggest there isn't a process. It's just to suggest that it looks a little different depending on the context. So sometimes the data does come first, you know, and that's an instance in which, maybe I'm like playing with a data set. There's some like visual exploration going on. Maybe I have a set of hypotheses that I'm starting to think about, and lo and behold, maybe I observe some correlation. Not making a causal argument at this point, haven't reported the story out at all, haven't talked to anyone, but hey, maybe there's an effect worth investigating. And this is the point at which the data allows me to kind of jump off that diving board and go into full on reporting mode. I would consider that to be a classic data reporting instance. There's then, I think, the classic investigative reporting instance, wherein you're not necessarily starting with the data set, you're starting with a set of accountability questions. You maybe have some public records on hand. You maybe have some interviews on book. You're trying to get a sense of how some factors are connected to one another. And then you bring in, somebody like me, you bring in a data reporter and say, hey, here's what I've got so far. And I'm wondering if there's any world in which we can ask a question about these two entities. In which case, that's much more of an investigative sleuthing activity. I'm,
Yeah.
maybe building a web scraper at that point, or, pulling down a couple of data sets and merging them and then building a statistical model of some phenomenon. So in that case, the data and the analysis come in service of a larger set of questions. They do not supersede or otherwise trump the traditional investigative reporting toolkit. They complement it. There's maybe a third type of story which is just wholly visual in nature, right?
Yeah.
We would say, hey, this point that we want to make, when we write it down, we can only do it in 500 words. We kind of can't cut it any more than that. But a chart could maybe do it in 400 by 400 pixels. So what if we were to cut these 500 words and just publish this chart alongside a story? In which case, I think that is a mode of data storytelling as well, right? And perhaps one of the modes that your audience is most familiar with, right? Just the data visualization story, the charticle, if you will. So I think there are a couple different modes. I think they interact in a lot of capacities. I wish I had a playbook. It might make my life easier, but I also think that the flexibility that comes with like being able to switch between these modes of reporting is probably part of what allows us to stay nimble.
It's fascinating. I see some customers, some of our have that ability in their organization, but again, some people, it's about they're the enlightened ones who've realized that data analytics isn't a bunch of analysts sitting in a corner, doing the CEO's demanded reports, right? It's about enabling those multiple facets and approaches to data. So that's a really, really good answer. So I wanted to ask one question about the Tableau Foundation, because you've got a partner with the Tableau Foundation. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how that came about and what how it works?
Gladly, yeah. No, we're big fans. Not least because they let us use their software and give us money. The partnership, was several years in the making. I mean, I think basically what happened is we got to talking, and the object of this conversation was the fact that there's a whole lot of climate data out there. There's a whole lot of socioeconomic and demographic data out there. There are a whole lot of data sets that would cater to something like a national environmental data journalism unit, something that doesn't really exist, right? The New York Times reports on climate change all the time, but they also report on other things. And, ProPublica, for example, they've published a lot of amazing, hard-hitting climate data stories, but they do a lot of other things as well.
Yep.
What would it mean to devote a whole team, right? A whole data-driven set of reporters to exclusively the question of climate data and climate data visualization. And what we thought that meant was that we could begin to offer, something like you mentioned earlier, the sense of like local contextual relevance that sometimes we didn't see in other modes of national reporting. The types of, emotionally felt and human stories that maybe weren't always reflected in other modes of data storytelling. We had a vision of what it meant to think about climate data reporting in a manner that we hadn't seen reflected elsewhere. And so with this little nugget of an idea, climate data journalism unit, we started walking this path together that looked a little something like, let's underwrite some of Grist's data visualization capabilities. Let's offer them use of our software. And I would argue, as somebody who's been a beneficiary of this partnership, most importantly, let's also ensure that their reporters have access to the data that they need when they need it. And sometimes it's easier said than done, right? But I can't tell you how many times as a nonprofit environmental reporter, right? Like if I want to get a hold of some proprietary insurance, damages data set, how difficult that can be, not least financially. But Tableau has a lot of customers. And so one of the great things about the foundation is that they're game to introduce us to folks who might have the data sets on hand that would be helpful in our reporting, right? So there are some really powerful in-kind components of this partnership that have strengthened our data reporting and data visualization beyond what dollars could ever hope to do.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, that's great. So, Clayton, look, this has been absolutely amazing. We could do this for hours, but we're kind of coming out of recording time. So tell us, how can we go find out more? Because I hope people have got excited about learning about Grist, the lessons they can apply to their own use of data. How can we find you, and where can we find Grist?
Yeah, gladly. Grist.org, grist.org. We're on the internet. We've been at the same place for the past 20 years, and we're not going anywhere anytime soon. If you're interested in some of this data work, you'll see it crop up all over the place on Grist, though we do publish quite a bit of other modes of media, right? We have a video team, we have an investigative reporting team, we have a set of environmental justice reporters. So play around on the site, you'll see a lot of great work. There is a data desk halfway down the page that'll hint at some of what we've touched on today. If you're interested in the Solutions Lab, grist.org/fix. And if you want to find me, I'm on Twitter at Compatibilism. That's probably the easiest way.
Fantastic. And there'll be links and on-screen things showing all of those places. So go check them out. Well, that was absolutely fascinating, Clayton. Really, really enjoyed this conversation. I've got things to go and think about. I'm gonna have to sit in an armchair and ponder what we just talked about. So,
well, you and me both.
Yeah. So thanks so much. Go to everybody watching. Go check out grist.org. Clayton, thanks very much, and we'll see you all again on the next episode of If Data Could Talk. Take care.
Thanks, Andy. Great to be here.